Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for your holy word. Help us to hear what it has to say to us today. In Jesus' name, amen. Today is not only September 11th, a remembrance of 9/11, but if I'm right, I may be wrong, I believe it is also Grandparents' Day. Today is Grandparents' Day. Now, whether you believe in Hallmark holidays or not, I think Grandparents' Day should be a holiday that we celebrate. My grandmother was a big part in my life. And I think back to spending time with Grandma. I called her Grandma, because of course that's the only way you should call your grandma. I spent a lot of time with Grandma, and she was in the antique business. And so a lot of my time with her was spent out with her shopping for antiques. I was there mostly to carry things. And I noticed that her taste in antiques got bigger and bigger as I got older and older. Where the last trip she wanted this stump that was used as an old butcher's block, and how to lug this around. And I learned a lot about antiques. It's something I still keep with today. I love to shop for old books and other things. But there are two kind of philosophies about antiques. One is, the general rule of thumb is, the older something is, the more valuable it is. That's kind of the rule of thumb. If you don't know anything about antiques, you look, if you see a date, if it's older, for the most part, it's more valuable. That's a kind of a common rule of thumb, except for electronics. Nobody wants old electronics. If you go to a garage sale, what do you see? Old technology, old computers, old VHSs, all these things that you really can't give away. You'll never go to an antique shop of any repute or any reputation and see rows of old monitors from computers that are marked up. For the most part, as something gets older, it gets more valuable. In technology, as it gets older, it gets less valuable. And I thought about that, and I go, what a wonderful metaphor for us to look at ourselves as a society. As a society, how do we feel valued as we get older? Do we feel more valuable to society as we get older? Or like electronics, do we get less valuable? I would say in our society, we get less valuable. At least that's the perception. That the older you get, the less valuable you are. But it's amazing because sometimes we can be surprised. For example, how many of you still have any old VHS Disney tapes? Any of you? Okay. Go home, take a look. Look for the Beauty and the Beast Black Diamond Edition VHS. If you bought it back then, you paid $19.99 for it. Right now, you could probably sell it for 50 cents at a garage sale. Right now, most appraisers say it's worth between $9,000 and $11,000. Now, remember what I told you with electronics, the older it gets, the less valuable you get. But sometimes we can be surprised. We can be surprised by the hidden value. And that's what I want to talk about today. Talking about growing older as a Christian. Even though society may say that our value declines as we get older, I think we as a church needs to recognize that we can be surprised at the worth that as you grow older in Christ, you bring not only to the church, but the value you have inherent in yourself. And I just want to read two quick verses. This is out of Psalm 92. And it's just the last couple verses of Psalm 92. And this is what it says. The righteous will flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar of Lebanon. Planted in the house of the Lord, they will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green, proclaiming the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and in him there is no wickedness. The psalmist compares growing older or older people as trees planted that still bear fruit in their old age. Now, I struggled with this message. really my biggest struggle was, how do I talk about people who are older? I was asked what my sermon title was before, and the only thing I could think of, I said, old people. And I was waiting for the punch to come out to knock me sideways. How do we refer to old people, elderly, etc.? When I teach church class, I always say you should refer to people at a certain age as heritage members. That's a nice, non-threatening term. But here's the problem I realized. Why is old a bad word? It's really in our society that old is a bad word. Right? We fear growing older. Everything we do, I think, sometimes is a response to growing older. And I won't call people out or anything, but if you've ever purchased a dye, a cream, taken a pill, if you've gone around the block a couple times to get the heart rate up, if you've ever bought certain clothes, all these things are a response to make oneself look old. There may be some of you who celebrated your 40th birthday for the 15th year in a row. And here's the thing, I know a lot of those things, I'm talking about the ladies, but even guys, we fear this old thing. How many mowing workers were laid off because they're overpaid and they can get a young guy in for much cheaper? We don't feel our worth when we get older. This is the society we live in. However, I wonder if the Bible has a different narrative, a different way of talking about being old. One is, the Bible is not afraid of age. It's really not afraid of age. Do you know what the word for old is in this verse 13? They will still bear fruit in old age. You know what the Hebrew word is? Gray-haired. They will still bear fruit even as they're gray-haired. Now imagine if I come up and said, "Good morning, gray hairs," if I walked up to a certain Sunday school class. I may survive, I may not. The Bible is very, but it's not afraid of age. Because whenever it speaks of the gray hairs, it speaks of several things. Of wisdom, of maturity, of faith, various things. Do you know what the other Hebrew word that's used even more often to speak of old people? The best English translation would be ancient. Antique. I think we'll stop there while I'm still ahead. The Bible's not afraid of age, because aging is a part of life. Aging is a part of existence. And unlike us, God does not see a time where you are less valuable. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven belongs to children. He talks about being young and then having kids, and he also talks about the blessing of old age. We as a society want to focus on being young, eternally young. But we're going to have to retrain our minds to think about what it means to grow older. Because here's the thing, we're going to be older longer than we're younger. I know that doesn't make sense, but it's the truth. We just got the girls some life insurance. Just a small policy, the whole family's in insurance, it's just what we do. And our agent said, "I'm glad you did that," because they're redoing the actuarial tables, how they figure out how much insurance costs. And they said, for girls born this age, the last couple of years, my girls are going to be 4. The life expectancy the insurance companies use, they're going to anticipate they're going to live to at least 105. So, theoretically, if you retire at 65, in a couple generations, you're going to retire and perhaps have half a life. Your midlife crisis will come at 65. And that changes the way we do everything, even our retirement. The first person who received retirement back in the 30s, she was 65 years old, received a check for $30, and she died 3 months later. And that's how it was thought of that. If you're going to be 65, you're not long for this world. Is that the case now? With the health and our medicine and our diets, we're living longer, and our kids. And so this notion of around 60, 70, you're no longer of use, right off into the sunset, it is not going to work anymore because we're going to be older longer than we're going to be younger. So how do we find worth? The other thing I want to talk about is old or being elderly is, it's all relative. I'm going to be 30 this October. My wife's getting me a coffin. This is a pinnacle. I'm going to be 30, and I don't feel, well, I feel old. I don't think I'm that old. However, I was watching one of my favorite movies growing up, and I realized that movie is older than the students I teach at Barclay. And that made me feel old. And then I was messaging a student, and I said, you need to turn this in, and they replied, Gucci, G-U-C-C-I. And so I didn't know what that was. I responded with a question mark, and they say, oh, sorry, that means good. It's something that young people say. And I go, oh. Young, old, these are all relative terms, but here's the problem, and why I want to talk about this, is the church sometimes inherits some of these worldly standards. I think it's a wonderful thing that our church specifically and churches in America have focused on reaching young people. I think that's a great thing. However, have we done that at the expense of old people? Have we done that at the expense? I remember growing up, whenever we wanted to do something new and innovative, the pastor would always talk about is, well, I'm doing this for you guys, but the old people don't want it. You can create this kind of combat. And guess what? The old people will lose out. But what are we missing as a church by not emphasizing, not celebrating those who are older in our congregations, those who have been in the faith? That's what I want to talk about today. Not only your role in the church, but your role as a person. If you consider yourself to be old, how do you continue to produce fruit, as the psalmist said? How do you continue to feel worth not only in yourself, but to feel worthy in the church? And how do we as a church recognize the worth of those who have been on this earth a little bit longer than we have? That's what I want to talk about today. One of the ways that old Christians, and I'm going to keep using old people, don't be offended. Once again, it's only because society says it's bad. That's a bad word. One of the things that old people have value and worth and produce, and one of the things the churches needs to recognize is their information and experience. It's funny, what do you call a carpenter who's been a carpenter for 40 years? A master carpenter. What do you call a craftsman who's been a craftsman for 40 or 50 years? A master craftsman. What do you call a Christian who's been a Christian for 50, 60, 70 years? They're just old. Right? We don't recognize as a church the value of experience. And scholars are recognizing this now. There's an island in the Pacific Ocean that meteorologists say is going to be hit by a hurricane in the next few years. The last hurricane that hit was 60 years ago, and it decimated the island. Destroyed all the food sources in this small island. However, they survived by digging up roots, looking through, finding things, kind of experimenting. Is this root poisonous? They eked by until the island could be built back up. Well, on this island, there is one woman who was alive when the last hurricane happened. And they treat her like a treasure. Because she is the one who knows which roots, which things that we would not think of as food can be eaten. And if she were to pass away, all that knowledge would be lost, and how much suffering would occur because people don't know what they can eat once their crops get destroyed, once the trees get blown down. Information and experience. We need to look to the old people in our church because they have walked roads that we are now just walking upon. And we so often don't look when we're having troubles. I remember when Jess and I, we lost our first baby. We had a miscarriage. I was at a loss. I didn't know what to think. I was helpless. I didn't know what to do. And I just kind of muddled through on my own. And it wasn't until about 6 months to a year later that I visited a woman in a nursing home. She was nearing 100. And She talked about, oh yeah, back in the 30s or 20s, I had a baby, and it was a blue baby, and it was dead when it was born, and we just had to kind of process through it. And I was stunned because when you think about a blue baby, these are medical issues that can be solved easily today. Back then, they were helpless. And I go, man, I wish I would have known, and I wish I would have asked or talked to her about that. Because she knows what it's like to be helpless. There's nothing you could do. Think about back then, the recession or the depression of the 30s. Some of you went through it. Some of you's parents went through that. When the Great Recession happened in 2008, who should we have turned to figure out what it means to live in economic uncertainty? Those who have went through it, but we didn't. We don't recognize those who have walked these trails before. And I think it's a great loss. Even in the church, when I talk to young pastors, one of their first complaints is, well, I want to do something for the church and the old people won't let me. And my first response to them is, well, do you think that maybe they've not tried something like that before? Do you think you're so clever as to think that you're the first person to think of this idea? And if they're saying no to you, are they just trying to save you a little bit of embarrassment? And they go, oh, that can't be right. That can't be right. No. We as the church, there are some of you who have walked through it and been a part of this church for many, many years, and you've seen things happen and things not happen. We, as young pastors, as young people, fail to take in the experience and information you have. This happens in the world, and this happens in the church. I want to tell you, your experiences, the information you have, the knowledge you have of Scripture, the knowledge you have of being a Christian in this life is so valuable. And don't ever think that your words are not valuable. Share the words, because once you're gone, you're gone. I've done too many funerals where the families really don't know what happened between 1940 and 1950. Really are not sure what happened in the 60s because they never bothered to ask. Jesse's grandmother was a child when the Soviets invaded Germany to take Berlin. This is at the end of World War II. Jesse's grandmother's father was shot as a war profiteer. Her 2-year-old brother starved to death as they were fleeing. They lost everything as a refugee as they fled. This was, I, to this day, am trying to get her to talk about this, trying to get something, because once you lose experiences like that, what do we always say? If you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And we believe that in every other area but the church. So I want you to feel worthy if you have experience in the church as a Christian. Share that experience. Another thing you have is generosity and patience. I had a come to Jesus moment with some of my students because they were complaining about old people. And they said, oh, old people sit, they don't do anything. And my come to Jesus moment, and I've been working on my anger issues, where I don't throw things anymore. But I said, hey look, because we were in the church in Haviland where the college has chapel. I said, how do you think this stays on? How do you think these lights stay on? Do you think we've hacked into the power supply? How do you think this was built? Generosity. And I'm going to say this. I told them, you guys right now in the church are living off the generosity of a generation. And in 15 years, you're going to wake up and the bank account is going to be empty because you never learned how to give, you don't know how to give, and you ran off all the people who didn't give. What I noticed among older Christians is they're very, very generous. They're very generous. A lot of churches in America today keep their doors open only because of that generosity. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying your worth only comes from what you give. What I'm saying is one of the benefits of being an older Christian is I think you realize every little bit counts. And you realize it's tough to give, it's tough to make room in your budget, but it's worth it. And God hasn't failed you yet. And it's not only generosity in money, it's generosity in time and talent. For those who say that old people don't volunteer, don't do anything, I would say this. They probably have done a lot. After how many years do you get to sit one out of it? After 50 years of volunteering at the church, do you get to take a break? The church exists as it does today because you guys in your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s volunteered. And if you're going to take a couple years off, that's fine. That's fine. I knew a woman who, they never ate out. Never ate out. Not once. Until, well, this would be about 10 or so years ago, they ate out at a restaurant and the wife thought this is the greatest thing ever. And now they eat out every meal and they can afford it, and I don't go for it. Take a break. You know, you've been cooking every meal for the last, 50 years. If you want a Pizza Hut to carry that load, go for it. Go for it. No one's going to blame you. You give. When we ask for volunteers, it's usually the older members, not the younger members who volunteer. And I know maybe you have more time, so on, but guess what? You could usually use that time as your own. You give. And we as a church need to appreciate that. Patience is the other thing. I heard this great quote from a theologian who was recently deceased because he was old. And he said this: the church is like a swimming pool. And like a swimming pool, most of the noise comes from the shallow end. I thought that was a great quote. Most of the noise comes from the shallow end. Meaning, I'll get asked sometimes to visit a church and poke my head around and give advice. And I'll look, and usually what I see is there are a lot of new Christians, a young pastor who want to change everything. The church is going to die unless we change everything. And guess what? You guys had one for about 3 years. Do you remember that god-awful screen we had hooked up that blocked everything? That was my way of saving you guys, saving the church. And what I always notice is it wouldn't be that difficult for the older members of the congregation to squash this. But they usually don't. They're patient. They'll sit through it, and if they don't like it, they may mention it, but usually they sit through it. What maturity there. To recognize that, the church is not going away. God's not through with the church. And you've been through things. And guess what? You're patient enough to realize that, putting the screen up is not probably going to help the church as much as Derek thinks, but it's also not going to harm the church as much as Derek thinks. It'll be something, and we move on. And you guys have been patient through a lot of things. Digging through the church, I found, of all things, a disco ball. And I go, what is this? And through my investigation, I found out that in the 70s, a young pastor thought it would be good to hang a disco ball in the baptismal as a way to show the church is connected with culture. And I have to think, wow, what a terrible idea that was. But also the patience that you had to let this pastor do this before you could somehow sneak it away into the farthest closet where 40 years later I stumble upon it. And if you think a disco ball in the church, that's ridiculous. Well, at the time, I bet that was thought of a way to be relevant to the culture. Sometimes the younger members, younger pastors can drive so much to be relevant that we tyrannize the church. G.K. Chesterton, a theologian, said, tradition is not a bad thing. Tradition protects the church from the tyranny of those who just happen to be walking around. Tradition protects the church from the people of today. And here's the other thing that I think we fail to realize is some of you have been through good pastors and bad pastors. Amen? You've been through great pastors and terrible pastors. But for most of you here, you are still members of this church. People of my generation, 30 and below, we are notorious church hoppers. I don't like the music, I'm going to another church. I don't like what the pastor said, I'm going to another church. They asked me for money, I'm going to another church. We have no patience. And I did that today in the chapel at Barclay College. I didn't like the music, I didn't like this, I didn't like this. Now, it's different because they're forced to go. It's part of their requirement, so they can't hop out, so they just complain. But some of you have been through some great ideas, but also some terrible ideas. There's been times in this church where, there was 250 in the sanctuary and 30 or 40 smoking out between sanctuaries, between services in the 50s and 60s. There are times in the late 80s where we had a negative balance in the checking account. You guys are still here. I think all of us can learn something about that. Church will never be what I exactly want it to be, but it may be exactly what I need to have at this time. So I'm not going to give up on the church. Finally, I think the most important thing is faith and hope. Faith and hope. The reason you guys are still here, the reason you guys still say I worship God even after 60, 70, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years of life is that you recognize that God is with us and God is still working in the good and the bad. Some people in our church, or formerly of our church, have watched one spouse, two spouses pass, have seen kids lost, who've seen their farm gone, who've seen disease after disease strike them, yet they still worship God. Jess and I go through a medical ordeal and we feel like the world's coming down on us. We don't know what to do. And I take great encouragement from watching. When I was an associate pastor in Leon, there was a farmer, and forgive me, I don't know, I have no sense of scale, but there was a late frost in March. And because of the late frost, he lost some of his crop. I believe it was a wheat crop. And once again, I have no sense of scale. I don't know if these numbers are correct, the ballpark, but he went from thousands and thousands of bushels that he was anticipating. He managed to salvage 300. And in my mind, I just go, you've lost everything. And I was asking him about it. I go, I'm so sorry. And the wife goes, well, yeah, but we won't starve. Make a way. We'll replant again. That only comes, that kind of faith and hope only comes through experience. This faith and hope that knows that I've been through the worst, but I've come out the other side. And that's why I think it's so important that we listen to the older members of our church, those who have walked with Jesus, because some of you right now are facing obstacles in your life and you think, I will never get around it, and God must not be here because I have no help. I know there are people in this church who have been miles past that obstacle. They have made it through it. Was it easy? No. Was it tough? Yes. But they made it through and God was with them. You can't get that from a book. I dare say you can't even really get that from Scripture sometimes. You can't get it from those who have walked with Jesus through good and bad. We need to learn from the older members of our congregation, those who have faith and hope. Because the reason they're here, the reason they worship with, and the reason they give and share is because they believe and have the hope that God is not finished with this country, or Macksville, or this church. Once again, don't misunderstand me. Can old people sin and make mistakes? Absolutely. But they are a valued part of our congregation, just as much as those in the quote-unquote middle age and those who are young. Margaret Mead, the sociologist, said that for any church to function, you need to have all three ages. Otherwise, it's not going to last. You need the old teaching the middle teaching young, and guess what? The young teaching the old. This kind of mutual teaching and service. Because when you've walked a path before, you can help remove some of those stones that will trip up the younger believers in Christ. There's something to be said about perspective. We always talk about having a kingdom perspective. We need to have a perspective that we can only learn from those who have walked that journey. Let me close with this. There's a parable about a farmer. An old farmer who saved up and bought a horse for his son. And the townspeople said, "Oh, isn't that great that you have a horse? You're able to buy a horse?" And the farmer said, "We'll see." Well, then the son was riding, and the horse bucked him off, and he broke his arm. The townspeople said, "Oh, isn't it terrible that your son broke his arm riding that horse? That's terrible." And the farmer goes, "Well, we'll see." Well, then a few days later, the king's men rode into town, and they were taking a draft of soldiers to go fight in this war. And because the son had broken his arm, he was unable to go with them, was able to avoid combat, so on. And the townspeople said, "Isn't this great that because your son broke his arm, he didn't have to go to war?" And the farmer said, "We'll see." It's so easy to think just because I'm right here at this very moment that I have the best perspective. I know exactly what's going on, what's best for me. But guess what? Because I'm young and because all of you are young, we're young, can you admit that we've all done that before? We've acted like we know everything. And sometimes the best thing for us is to make those mistakes, to fall down. However, there's sometimes that because we make mistakes in our youthful arrogance, we cause great pain to ourselves and others. And that doesn't have to be. Because when you come to church, you're not coming to church just to worship God or to be around people your age. You're with people who have walked with Jesus, who have walked those paths and have stumbled. And guess what? We may think that TVs or new community things or painting or this outreach program is the best thing ever. But age should teach us humility to recognize that we may not have all the answers. So as we grow old, as I grow older, as they grow older, as some of you grow older, I pray that you never feel like you're worthless. I pray that you never feel like God doesn't have anything for you to do. And I apologize if the church has ever made you feel worthless. For you offer a living example of what it means to follow Christ from good and bad, through up and down, through everything. I pray that we as a church can learn from that. We pray with me, please. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day, and Lord, I pray that wherever we're at in our walk with Christ, that we have the humility to ask for help, that we have the humility to listen to the thoughts and ideas of others. So, Father, if we're old, help us to listen to the young. If we're young, help us to listen and respect the old. Father, I pray that we would work together as a church, that we would not be divided upon age lines, but we recognize that just like a family is incomplete without a father and mother, without a grandfather and grandfather, without kids when they should be there. A church can be incomplete when we miss those things. Father, you've told us that there is no difference between us and Christ Jesus. So I pray that we join together in unity, seek the best for each other, and with love and respect, let all the voices come together and say in Jesus' name, amen.